Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and I'm joined here as always with my wonderful and lovely co host, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Ryan. How about yourself?
Oh, I am living the dream.
Good.
Seeds are getting in the ground, so you can't complain about that. We've been having these little windows of getting corn and soybeans into the ground lately between rain, and so it's just another rainy day today. So it's a perfect time to meet and record this podcast.
Yeah, I we keep I had a meeting the other day and I think that it's a meeting with agronomists when the first thing you do is your weather report, right? Like you can absolutely tell who you're talking with. When I talk to normal other people outside of this, it's, hey, how are you? What'd you do last week? When I talk to agronomist people, it's, well, we've had 3 10 7 inch the last 2 days.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you can absolutely tell your crowd. But I've been talking to a lot of people, and we talk about the rain and the weather, and you're right. It gives us a good opportunity to get into some other stuff and talk about some things, maybe find perspective of what we could have been doing last year. I think at this point last year, we might have actually already been talking about drought articles and what we were going to be doing for some of that stuff. So, every year's a new year, and we're really fortunate to have another one, and that's what makes this job fun, isn't it?
That's right. This time of year, there's usually nothing wrong yet, but it's always different, right? Either it's wet, dry. These are where we start to think about the problems that we'll have later on in the season. So everything always starts peachy, and then we go from there. And so one thing that I've been kind of talking to a lot of folks in the last few months as we kind of move towards planting and actually seeing crops out in the field is talking about tissue and nutrient sampling. I think it's maybe an underutilized tool. So we talk a lot about soil sampling, and most of our soil samples have probably been taken at this point in the year. And we all have our reports that tell us what we need to do when it comes to adding fertility. But we do have options in season, some pretty valuable options that we can use to really get a good idea of where our plants are at and how are they actually using that fertility that we're putting down right now sometimes.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of different episodes, right? I think we're very fortunate in this time that we're farming and what we're doing. And I think back to nematode sampling and disease sampling and analysis. And we did a PSNT sampling. Um, there's just so many options that we have, right? It's almost inexcusable anymore for us to not have this holistic picture of what's going on our farm, right? And a lot of this stuff is very inexpensive. We don't want to say cheap because if you say cheap, people don't think it's worth anything. So we're going to
There
say
you go.
good analytics for a very low and sometimes free price. And so I think for us as agronomists or extension or any of the folks that we're working with, we've got this amazing luxury that we forget about in we can go out, we can say, frankly, I don't know, but I know someone that does, right? If you can give me 7 to 10 days, we can take the sample, we can send it out, and we can have some pretty good diagnostics as to what's happening for not a lot of money. And I think it's awesome that we're here and we've got the specialists and the people to talk to us about it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you're right. We have this luxury of so many tools that we can use. I think where navigating all those tools, that's the important part, right? When do you use specific tools? Because like you said, we have a lot of inexpensive tools that we can use, but it can all add up, right? So we need to learn when do we implement these and where are they going to give us the most value. So, Justin, do
I
you
think
have
we've got
anything else
just a
to
guy
add?
to
Or
help us figure that out, right?
yeah, I think that's a perfect way to start, right? We need to be educated on when we should use some of these tools as well. So we brought someone on here to join us today to talk about exactly that. We have Dr. John Spargo on today. He is a specialist on our team at the university, and he's an associate professor and director of the Ag Analytical Lab. So anything that has to do with soil testing, tissue testing, they do all kinds of analysis. And if I tried to list them off, I would get them all wrong. So I'm going to let him introduce what he does and what his lab does on campus.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Morning, Justin. Glad to be on. Yeah, from a balmy 52 degrees here in Happy Valley, a chilly May morning. So yeah, excited about the opportunity to be on. I can talk a little bit more about what the lab does above and beyond soil fertility testing. Soil testing is, just in terms of numbers, by far our largest program. We run about 60,000 samples a year. It's also our oldest. We've been offering that service since the early 1950s. In addition to soil fertility testing, we do offer plant tissue analysis for, everything from, agronomic crops to fruits and vegetables, even some landscape crops. We do manure, compost, and biosolids testing, all of the, the non-traditional soil amendments, water testing, and actually maybe one of the lesser known services that we offer that I think has gained a lot of interest is we actually do a lot of soilless media testing, and most of that program is actually targeted to green roofs. But yeah, soil fertility testing and the plant tissue testing, certainly the two that go commonly into nutrient management for agronomic crops.
John, how long have you been with Penn State, and what's a little bit of your background that got you interested in analytics and testing?
Oh, sure. Well, I think I'm in my 12th year here with the university.
We're not going to use that to date you or anything. It's
Yeah,
just
I
we
appreciate
like to know
that.
the background of our specialists.
Appreciate that. Prior to coming to Penn State, I had a similar position with the University of Massachusetts for a shorter stint there. I was there for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was a scientist with the USDA Agriculture Research Services. And actually, one of my first interactions with the Penn State Analytical Services Lab was as a client. We sent a lot of our research samples this way, and I worked with a number of growers down in that region. We were working in Maryland and Virginia to send their samples through here, both soil and plant tissue, as well as quite a few manure samples.
Well, there we go. We have another former Massachusetts. I guess I don't know if native. I don't know if we've talked about this, but both my parents went to UMass, and I grew up in Massachusetts, so I know that area well. And I didn't realize that you had spent some time there.
Yeah, not neither.
Yeah, so maybe you can answer this, the value of testing, right? When we talk about these services, right, there's a lot of things that we offer, and on your end, you have to choose what tests are valuable or not valuable to offer as a program. So maybe you can talk a little bit about like where plant tissue testing fits into this and why is that valuable for an ag producer?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think not many people would argue that soil fertility, soil testing is probably our most important tool for managing soil fertility. And we've widely recognized that the soil test values provide us the information we need to predict nutrient needs, especially phosphorus and potassium, and of course, measuring soil acidity and predicting how much lime is required to, bring the soil up to a target pH. Where plant tissue testing comes into this spectrum, while we're using soil testing to predict nutrient needs, the plant tissue test actually gives us a measure of the nutrients actually taken up by the crop, and sort of offers us another view or perspective. And again, I as you guys were saying in the introduction, with all of these tools available to us, gives us a more holistic view. Every measurement data point that we've got gives us additional information. Um, the other unique thing about plant tissue testing in terms of understanding nutrient measurements is that I already mentioned soil testing in the Mid-Atlantic and in Northeast region does a really good job of helping us predict phosphorus and potassium needs. It falls short on nitrogen and most of the micronutrients. Whereas with plant tissue analysis, we get a really good measure of nitrogen sufficiency, sulfur sufficiency. Both are difficult or impossible with soil testing, as well as the whole suite of micronutrients. A much more reliable assessment of micronutrient sufficiency than what we can get from soil testing in our region. In terms of how plant tissue testing has been traditionally used, and I think as I put myself in this category. It's one of the first tools I reach to for diagnostic purposes. When we see what we suspect might be a nutrient deficiency or just poor performance out in the field, plant tissue testing is often the tool that we reach for to either verify a suspected nutrient deficiency or determine if the symptoms we're observing are in fact a nutrient deficiency. And it's set up to do that for us. And it's a good tool for that. I think where we've underutilized plant tissue testing as a means of just monitoring nutrients over time and helping to refine our fertility management. And in that regard, where it can really be useful is giving us a measure of what's often referred to as hidden hunger. So a nutrient deficiency that's there that may be reducing yield potential, but may not be so severe that it's showing up with visual symptoms.
And I think that's a good point, and maybe we've touched about it a little, and maybe we've talked about it a lot. But uh, plant tissue testing is maybe I'll simplify but it's a little bit of science, or a lot of science, and a little bit of an art, right? This is not as clean cut as maybe a soil test or maybe a feed sample or something you've looked at in the past, because what you're getting is a normalized range of it should be between this point and this point phosphorus within this plant. And it's not something that we can absolutely track back and say if you're on the high end or the low end, that means we need to add 15 more pounds of phosphorus to this soil, right? Or have we gotten to the point of that? Or are we using this more as a tool to kind of say, yeah, actually, we're a little low. We should add 15 pounds. Or how do we interpret this and how do we use it?
Yeah, great question, Justin. And I've got two answers. Let me see if I can weave it together. So in terms of looking at its sufficiency ranges for a given nutrient, a couple of things that are important to keep in mind. One, we've got to be sure that we're collecting samples from the correct plant part at the correct growth stage, because those sufficiency ranges are all defined based on those criteria. And the reason that is because nutrient concentration varies within the whole plant, across different growth stages, but it also varies within the plant at any given growth stage among different plant parts. And that has to do with, as plants go from vegetative stages to reproductive stages, nutrients are reallocated within the plant from tissue into the reproductive organs, grain and whatnot. And then on the plant part, those concentrations can vary, particularly even within the vegetative growth stages, because of the mobility of nutrients. So, we often, are taught as agronomists for, diagnosing visual deficiencies, looking for, symptoms in the new growth versus old growth. For example, nitrogen is kind of the classic example of that. Nitrogen is very mobile within the plant, so deficiencies tend to show up on the old growth first. Sulfur is an example of a less mobile nutrient. We often see those deficiencies show up on the new growth first. So, that's why we have to define, specific plant growth stages and plant parts. And when we look at, sufficiency tables for, you know, the essential nutrients, they are all defined at different growth stages. And, all labs, including Penn State, will provide, sampling guidelines to target those stages. Where that's really useful is for the routine monitoring. So if we want to get a better handle on making sure that our crops have all of the essential nutrients in the optimum ranges, we sort of have to set out at the beginning of the season with that plan. Okay, we're going to target those growth stages. We're going to collect samples, get them to the lab, and get those measurements made. And I like to think about those as more it, especially for agronomic crops, we may not be looking at those to try and get emergency applications done this year, but it's certainly information that we can use for the next year. Quite often, the with a few exceptions, the things that we're getting a measure of, you may not have the opportunity to make an application in that growing season. There are a couple of exceptions to that. For the most part, we're looking at it more as a long-term tracking tool. If that deficiency, if those deficiencies are showing up in that field this year, odds are pretty good that those conditions may be present again in that field, and it may need to be something that's addressed. The other point that I wanted to circle back and make is that, oftentimes when we do see those nutrient values, say on the low range, either, deficient or, perhaps even down in that hidden hunger range, it is important to look back and try and determine why that nutrient's not getting into the crop. It's often, the first thing we leap to is, well, we need to apply more of it. There's an insufficient concentration of that nutrient in the soil. Well, obviously we can look at our soil test results and get a measure of that. But there are also, a number of other things that may influence the nutrients or the plant's ability to acquire that nutrient. A good example is potassium, and situations where we've got some sidewall compaction. This is a year that I suspect we'll see some of that. We've had a pretty wet spring, and we're pushing, past optimum planting dates for some of our crops. So some of us are going to try and push it a little bit, and we might get a little bit of sidewall compaction, and you can see some early season potassium deficiencies. Got nothing to do with the potassium concentration of soil. It's just we've created a physical barrier for that crop to access that. Another really common example, and this one tricks me quite often, the alfalfa yellows, and it's a boron deficiency, but it's a boron deficiency that shows up because of droughty conditions, not because the soil doesn't have enough boron.
Right. I think you've hit on something really important, and is that, this, like we've been talking about, it's one tool, right? And it's how we put this tool into its given context that becomes even more so important. So pairing it with a soil test, you can answer the question, well, what's in my soil? What do I know is in my soil? And most of those values are given in your plant available form. But, sometimes when it comes to like those issues you're saying with hidden hungers, you might see a deficiency in one nutrient, but it's also related to a deficiency in another nutrient, right? Or maybe there's something going on in the field. I mean, like if we're talking about nitrogen management, which wouldn't necessarily be something you'd be testing, but where we might have residue that's taking up a lot of tying up some nutrients, and that might be tying up other nutrients, right? So there's a lot of dynamics going on. So it's one piece of evidence that we can use to diagnose an issue or just understand the picture of that field. So one question I have is, do you have an overall recommendation for should tissue testing be used primarily as a diagnostic tool, or is this something that you think folks should be regularly doing in their field, regardless of a problem that they're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think it's definitely a useful tool for diagnosing nutrient deficiencies. Diagnosing, uh, crop performance problems, determining if they are nutrient deficiencies. I think it's underutilized for routine management, and I think we should use it more often for that. One point that I wanted to come back to on the, our sampling guidelines and those sufficiency tables are all really set up, designed specifically for the routine use scenario. When we're collecting samples for diagnostic purposes, where, say we go out to a field and we see, there's some sort of a symptom, lack of crop vigor, or, discolored leaves, something along those lines, and we want to determine is this related to nutrient nutrient issues. Quite often when those symptoms start to pop up, it may not be at one of those, specific growth stages, where we've got those sufficiency tables to compare things to. Even when it does lay out or correspond with one of those growth stages, I think one of the best strategies to get a sample for diagnostic purposes is oftentimes when we see, especially with nutrient deficiency symptoms in a given field, there are some areas that are affected and some areas that aren't. So we sort of got this, in-field control that we can use to compare, between good and bad areas. So we'll go out and, the best strategy is to go out and collect a good representative sample from the affected area where, the deficiency symptoms are showing up, and then go into, an adjacent normal area where all other conditions, same cultivar, same planting date, same field, same weather, and collect a sample from the same plant part, same growth stage, submit both of them, good versus bad, and then look at those nutrient concentrations, really helps us narrow in and provides us a I'd argue maybe even a more accurate, reliable assessment of, what the most limiting nutrient is than, the sufficiency tables that we have to look up for routine use. Likewise, with those paired samples, also a really good idea to collect soil samples from the same two locations. With that, if say it did turn up to be a micronutrient deficiency. Well, now if we have those paired samples, we can start looking at things like, say for manganese, a high pH is often the culprit, and we can start looking at pH between those two and see if that's what's going on.
I think specifically there was once that you helped talk me through exactly what you're outlining, right? And this was a zinc deficiency in corn, and what we were looking at was we had a field where we had some cooler, wetter ground compared to maybe some more dry stuff, right? And that gets back to that micronutrient deficiency, but it's just kind of what we're talking about, right? The diagnostics and the ease that we can kind of maybe we can call this somewhat easing our mind too. We go out and we look and we see this corn, and part of our field is just this beautiful green color, and the other part now has this yellow striation. And typically when I work with producers, the first place their mind jumps is herbicide problems, right? I've had something wrong in the tank. There's been a mistake with that. Oh my gosh, this corn is going to die, right? I don't know. I think it's worst case scenario, right? I think it's humans, or at least in agriculturally related humans, worst case scenario is the first always in our mind. And then a lot of times it could be something we've mentioned being hot and dry or cool and wet, having a lot of influence on some of these micronutrients that we can say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's take a couple samples here. I'll admit they're destructive, and we can be somewhat resistant to want to cut out 15, 20 corn plants at times. But in the whole grand scheme of 25, 27,000 corn plants, we're not going to miss that 15 or 20. But getting that done and sending it off to the lab for this really can be such a way to just relax and say, okay, we're going to wait for it to dry up. We're going to wait for it to kind of warm up. But maybe next year we need to think about some zinc in our starter or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. No, and yeah, Justin, I appreciate you bringing up the 15 to 20 plants. It is, in order to get a really good representative plant sample, it does take quite a few. And you want to make sure that you've got a good representation of the average conditions, even if it is in a localized area where you're trying to diagnose things. I'd say for most plant samples, we want to pull from at least 10 plants. I'd say 15 is better, 20 is best.
And we'll put a link to all of this from the lab in the show notes, because I think one thing that I'd like to reinforce in why I see this not be as effective is these are very specific timings. And when it starts, especially things related to spring, so I'll backtrack and say soil sampling, right? We always say we're going to soil sample in the fall. Well, fall got busy because of this or that, right? So we soil sample in late fall or early winter, or we just keep moving on and it gets down the road. My advice to people is the sooner you can get on a schedule, the better, but there's no bad time to soil sample if you haven't, right? Um, with plant tissue testing, there is in fact bad time to tissue test, and it becomes very specific on what you need. And we'll put this list of where and how you need them. And in the spring, there are 1,000 things you need to do, right? And we go into this with the best intentions, but which one's going to hit the bottom of the pile is that's that new thing that you haven't done before that, yeah, you're a little reluctant on the value. So we'll make sure to get all of that, and maybe you can start thinking ahead towards fall or spring of next year and kind of understanding what this protocol looks like.
Yeah, so since we're segueing into this, maybe John, you can share with us so we have this lookup table where you can decide, okay, my corn is in the seedling stage, so I should sample all of the above ground portion and sample about 20 to 30 plants, right? So that's my recommendation. Well, from that point, maybe we can talk about how you need to prepare the sample to get to the lab, and then we can start to talk about some of the different protocols that you all use, and maybe why you choose the ones that you use. So we'll just start with the question of how do you prepare a sample on the farmer end or the agronomist end?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, going to the sampling guidelines from the lab that you're working with, obviously we'll include some links to the Penn State Analytical where you can find those resources. Um, Collecting your representative sample, one of the first things we need to look at is if you've applied, if any foliar nutrients or fungicides that may contain any of the nutrients where we want to look at. Obviously, important to wash things off before they're submitted. Also, especially when we're sampling young plants, for example, corn seedlings or anything under a foot tall, we want to look for soil contamination on those. It doesn't take much soil contamination on those samples to start compromising the results. If it's just a little bit, it can often just be just shaken loose if it's dry. If shaking it doesn't get it clean, then washing it off. You can buy distilled water from the grocery. Distilled water will be fine for it. If you do end up washing the samples, you do want to lay them out and let that surface water dry before you pack them up. Once that's happened, or if you haven't washed them, if you've just taken them out of the field, they need to go into a breathable package. A brown paper bag works really well. You don't want to pack things too tight because you don't want that plant sample to start to decompose before it gets to the lab. Shipping it off to the lab as quickly as possible. Overnighting, if it's mid-season and things have started to warm up, is probably a good idea. If you're going to send it ground, we want to make sure it gets to the lab at least within a couple of days. And thinking about the shipping days, if we're going to ship it ground, we probably don't want to ship it on a Thursday because it's not going to make it to the lab until Monday, which means it's going to sit in a hot warehouse, all weekend long. And what the lab's going to end up with on Monday is probably not a very useful sample. So those are the logistics for getting the sample. Obviously, filling out all of the submission forms and providing all of the requested information on those is really important. It tells the lab both what the sample is so that we can handle it appropriately, but more important than that, by knowing what the plant is, which growth stage it was collected, and which plant part, if it isn't the parent, gives us the information we need in order to interpret what those results are and help you make some meaning out of the results when they come back to you. So when the sample is received at the lab, the very first thing that happens to it is we push it into an oven. It's an oven that's at a temperature high enough to remove all of the moisture, but not actually cook the sample. 65 degrees Celsius is the target that we all go for. Our goal is to try and get that sample dried down certainly within 16 hours. Sometimes depending on the plant part and the size of the sample, it may take 24 hours. We do want to make sure that it's completely dry, but we're trying to get that done as quickly as possible so that we can get the sample processed, analyzed, and the results out. So after that sample's been dried, the next thing we do is run it through a mill. We're trying to reduce the particle size of that sample down to less than 1 millimeter. So almost, not quite as fine as talc, but definitely a powder. And there, the purpose is so that we can homogenize it and end up, because we're just going to pull a very small subsample of that for the actual analysis. For example, for the nitrogen measurement, we're only looking at about 1/4 of a gram, not very much. I mean, less than a thimbleful to get the nitrogen measurements. We want to make sure that subsample is very homogeneous before and representative of the whole sample. So for nitrogen, we've got an instrument that's all it does is measure nitrogen. And we've just got to dry and pulverize the sample, and we can feed it to it all day long, and it'll continue to crank those out. For all of the other nutrients that we're measuring, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, zinc, copper, iron, manganese, we take that sample and we actually dissolve it in some strong acid, basically digesting that sample, bringing it all into a solution, turning it into a liquid. And then that sample is introduced to an instrument we call an ICP. And that ICP gives us a measure of the concentration of all of those other nutrients besides nitrogen. And it's a pretty standard equipment. Most labs have that same equipment and similar procedures, most agricultural labs. And what we're getting is a measure of the total nutrient concentration and that plant sample. There are a couple of cases where we might actually, instead of looking at the total nutrient concentration, we want to look at, say, just the nitrate fraction, and in some cases for some crops, maybe just the potassium concentration, either in the sap or extractable. For us in Pennsylvania, throughout the Mid-Atlantic and most of the Northeast, a really common one that is utilized is the cornstalk nitrate test. And I don't know if you guys have talked about that on the podcast before, but that's one that's not an in-season test. It's actually an in-season, end of season test, and it's more or less used to evaluate the effectiveness of our nitrogen management throughout the season, with the idea being that, we can use that knowledge that we gain from that to help improve our nitrogen management in subsequent seasons. That's pretty much the only one that I can think of where, it's something other than a total measurement of the nutrients in plant tissue.
So what I'm looking at here is your complete or standard acid digestion tests are the ones, not the end of season core nitrate test, but the standard tissue testings, your complete or standard acid digestion. And I'm curious, some of the farmers that I work with, they have started experimenting with sap testing. And so I just want to hear from your perspective why you guys go the route of total tissue acid digestion rather than SAP testing, and maybe what the different values even tell you.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me answer the second question first. The reason why we use the methods that we do is because we've got lots and lots of research supporting the interpretation of those results. Really important when we talk about analytical testing that we follow standards. And the reason is because we're using those measurements that we're making to compare them to established thresholds that have been lots and lots of research has gone into supporting those. And that applies to plant tissue testing, soil testing, most of the measurements that we make. We talk about analytical methods, really important that we're all following standards. On SAP testing, it's a really interesting one. It's been around for a long time. It's most of the work that's been done with that has been in high value intensively managed crops. The most of the work that I'm familiar with that's been done with it has come out of Florida, a lot of vegetable production in that region, some out of the Pacific Northwest, especially with potatoes. Um, the the really nice thing, in my understanding, with SAP testing, the reason why it really caught on is because it allows you to get a really quick measurement there in the field. Um, you basically can pull a sample. Generally, the plant part that's collected is the petiole. It's nice and succulent. You can get a lot of sap squeezed out of it. Um, and most of the measurements and guidelines are generally limited to nitrogen and potassium. And the reason is because those are the two nutrients most commonly included for like fertigation. So a real great opportunity to, really get your nutrient, well, nitrogen and potassium fertigation really well dialed in, because you can, basically make your application and come back a couple days later and get the SAT measurement. Not to speak poorly of SAP testing, I will say that it's also recognized as semi-quantitative. So, it's not as it'll never be as robust a measure of a total nitrogen or a total nutrient measurement, just because the nature of how the sample is collected. You're squeezing the sap out of a plant sample, and I mean we've all seen, I think as agronomists out in the field, plants in the early morning, standing up tall, they're full of sap. They've got lots of vigor and turgor. Those cells are all full of water, and then later on in the day, as it gets hot, especially if it's been dry out, they start to wilt a little bit. Those leaf stomata have closed up, and there's just not as much water in there. Well, that changes the concentration. If we're trying to squeeze and measure nutrient content in those, it's really tough. So even with those field tests, the guidelines stand up to say, you've got to collect them at very specific times throughout the day. But when you start looking at the the hold times that are required for those. I mean, you're kind of looking at, if unless you're going to preserve it in some way, that samples that generally needs to be tested within just a couple of hours of it being collected. Well, that's pretty tough to get that sample and pulled off to a lab. So you're limited to a field kit, and a field kit's never going to be as accurate as what you can do in the lab. It's just, that's just the limitations of the technology. And then where we are looking at, there are ways that you could preserve it, say freeze it or pack it on ice. Now we're looking at having to overnight a sample off to a lab. Now all of a sudden, all of the things that made SAP testing, more convenient as an analytical tool, we're kind of getting away from those. So I know there are some folks that have looked at offering that, within a laboratory, and it may have some applications in specific, growing systems and nutrient management protocols, but they're few and far between. I haven't seen that with agronomic crops yet.
Sure, and so the standard SAP test really only tells you the nitrogen and potassium, versus your total analysis that gives you all of these micronutrients. Is that the case all the time?
We have seen, no, you can run that SAP, right on an ICP just like we do. The
Okay.
challenge it's very difficult to standardize because it's difficult to get, representative SAP extract, or, getting that sample to the lab, where it could be, uh, processed consistently. Lots of folks have tried, and there is, some work that's out there, trying to look at it in some crops. I'm familiar with, a little bit that's been done in rice, and maybe even a little bit in soybean petioles. Um, it's it's a real challenge to get a representative sample. And, again, when we've got the standard, to compare it to, we've got a good set of guidelines for the total nutrient, measurements, the acid digests and total nitrogen. Um,
So you kind of brought up a good point. I'm looking at the soybean specifically, in the total analysis. If we're collecting the sample prior or during initial flowering, we want 2 to 3 fully developed leaves at the top of the plant. Um, is there more to this? Do we need to do this in the early morning? Do we need to do this in the afternoon? But because we're doing, does it matter now with this one?
Not if we're looking at total nutrient
Okay.
content. That's right. That's right. The sample still needs to get to the lab before it started to decompose, but it doesn't have to be shipped overnight on ice, because we're going to measure the total nutrient content. So it losing a little bit of water, that's fine. It losing a little bit of
Makes your
water if we're
drying
trying to get
time a
a,
little easier.
that's exactly
Okay.
right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
But we don't want people to try and dry them at home before they send them, right? This is still an immediate type situation.
Generally unnecessary.
Okay.
We've certainly worked with some folks that have done that, and it's certainly possible. It won't speed things up for you. In fact, it would probably slow you down. Yeah. And our goal once it hits the lab is, to try and turn those around as quickly as possible, particularly because these are often diagnostic samples where it may be important to know, there in that growing season what the issue is, because there might be an opportunity to try and address it. I will say that, Penn State, and I'd say, most reputable labs, while we all try and turn them around as quickly as possible, we're not going to compromise quality, in order to achieve that. It doesn't do you any good if we can turn results out within 12 hours if, we don't have any confidence in the results.
So I have one question about sampling, and these are very specific spots. Forage pasture grass is the foremost uppermost leaf blades. Mature leaf blades taken about a third of the way down. When you think about how they came to this, was there as much trial and error involved in this as what it would seem from just like the 30,000 foot view of these people had all these graduate students just clipping plants at different places and then, kind of comparing this back? Or how did we get to this point, John?
Yeah, great question, Justin. I've tried to chase that down, even just on corn plants. Some of it, obviously with, well, let's take the example with corn. If we're looking at a plant that's, less than 12 inches tall, and we see a deficiency out there, depending on the nutrient and our management system, we still have an opportunity to fix it, right? it do something. It may not totally repair it, but we have an opportunity to get over the top and make an application. Um, there's not much equipment, at least in the areas that I've been traveling recently, where we can, get an application of anything significant into a cornfield past tasseling. We do have more and more high clearance stuff, but it's not something most people have parked in their shed. So that's part of it is, we're trying to collect samples at a point where they've got to provide meaningful information, but it's also got to be, give us an opportunity to do something about it. I will say that as we push earlier in the season, especially with annual crops, deficiencies, generally don't show up, and the ones that do, it's usually more there's a cultural problem. Like again, thinking about corn as the example, it's not uncommon at all to see a little bit of purpling. And corn when it's in the 3 to 4 leaf stage, more often than not, it's just because the soils are a little bit cool. There may be plenty of phosphorus there. It's just the plant's having a hard time picking it up because it's too cool. Um, the addition of it will have zero impact on yield. So collecting a plant sample at that time may not really provide us, that much useful information because later on it's something that's going to resolve anyway. I guess the other piece to that, we also want to make sure that, and this is why, we are collecting plant samples from corn at silking, because at that time, you know, deficiencies, it is a sensitive measure to deficiencies that, that it gives us a really good measure of overall crop nutrition, even though it may not be, at a stage where we can take action that season. It does provide us useful information that we can implement in following seasons.
And you guys know how I love a tangent or a sidebar, but we have these conversations about short-statured corn, and maybe this is one of these things, right? As we start moving towards a shorter statured corn, maybe this prior to tasseling and from tasseling to silking, we're talking about the clearance and drones is a conversation for another day and the effectiveness of some of that, but maybe as we move into some of these other opportunities agronomically, we can see where understanding where we're at that silking point can maybe provide us something that, again, we maybe can't do anything about this year by the time we take the sample and we address it and we know how slowly things can kind of move that late in the year. But it might put us in a position that we can say, hey, next year we need this X, Y, and Z to be able to get back over this corn a little later than we thought. So, I think it's all what we're preparing for the next season. But no years are the same, right? So we just have to be prepared for that too.
But I guess that's the value of these tests. It gives you evidence, and then you can turn around and use that, take that evidence to inform your next decision, whether that's in the season or in the next season. It's just adding value and collecting science-based information about your own fields is always important. So I think we can kind of move towards a close here. So, John, I have one question about the tissue testing. Could you give us an idea of maybe the cost for folks that have listened to this and they're ready to go and take their tissue samples? What does this cost to send in? And I'm also kind of curious from your end, does that cost pretty much just cover the how much it costs to analyze the samples, or does some of that also go back into the lab and improving and investing in these protocols?
Hey, good question, man. So the fee for the standard plant tissue analysis at Penn State's $24, and that's pretty well that agrees pretty well with the market value of it. Um, to answer your second question, the Penn State Analytical Lab is a unique operation within the university. Uh, Without getting too much into the details, it's basically a cost recovery operation. So the fees that we bring in for the services that we offer go to paying everyone's salary here, keeping the lights on, buying new instruments, and all that sort of thing. Um, so, more or less as a similar to the way a private lab operates, but we get Penn State letterhead.
So, John, one of the things on that notion of price with soil testing, right? We always have this conversation of, hey, I shopped like three labs and this one's $1 cheaper. I'm going to jump to this lab instead of this one. And from my point as an educator, my comment is always consistency, right? I like to see you go through Penn State because I can access it and we've got this opportunity there. Uh, but frankly, I want it to be a reputable lab, and I would much rather see you go to the same one every 3 years because we know we're getting kind of the same metrics. Is that a similar thing with these within tissue testing, or are most of these extractants the same, or does that not have as much of a bearing as what we would see with something like soil sampling?
Yeah, this is actually an interesting one, this is beyond the scope of the show now, but I'll go down in the weeds a little bit. Um, with soil fertility testing, even though we're all using the same methods, there's always a little bit of lab bias, and it's from the most what would seemingly be the most mundane things like Spectrum uses a beaker that's this tall with this diameter, and Penn State uses one that's this tall with this diameter. And even though we're both using the same Malic 3 extractant, that can have an impact. Even the grade of the filter paper. Now, within the interpretive ranges that we have for soil fertility testing, it probably doesn't really make that much difference. But if we're trying to, just absolutely minimize the the control for the variability, I like your approach. Send it to the same lab. And we're all priced pretty much the same. And we offer a dealer rate. You just got to ask about it. So, if somebody's coming to us and they either want to prepay for the services and buy a whole bunch up at the beginning of the season, or they're collecting samples from multiple farms and submitting them in big batches, we take 20% off the top. And you start doing that on a test that's already pretty affordable. It's a pretty good deal. So your answer, I think, is spot on. And it's pretty much the same way that I communicated. I'd love it if you sent it to us. I know the methods that we run. I know the framework that we use to interpret the results. If it's not to us, I can give you a long list of reputable labs that you can send it to. Stick with the same one, so that we remove that lab bias. Answer your second question on plant tissue testing. When we talk about at least the standard rates, there are a couple of different ways to peel that orange, but they generally come back with because we're measuring totals. It's not just an extractable fraction. They generally agree pretty well with one another. There's always a little bit of lab bias, but I almost think that there's probably as much lab bias for those kinds of testing as there is within a lab between two instruments or between two analysts. It's pretty tight. And we all participate in proficiency programs, and we can look at that data, and it's pretty impressive how tight it is. SAP testing, on the other hand, that kind of gets into that Malick versus Bray versus Morgan. It's just impossible to standardize.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, John, I think I've certainly learned a lot here about tissue sampling and how to implement it correctly, I think is just as important. And I think this is a wonderful tool and resource that people ought to take greater advantage of in season to really diagnose some of the issues they're seeing in the field and make more informed decisions. So do you have any last minute thoughts, John, that we haven't gone into in this episode that you want to say?
No, I think we hit it all. I had a short list of bullet points that things that I wanted to be sure and mention, and the ones that I forgot, you guys prompted me for. So yeah, no, I appreciate it. Appreciate you guys being good hosts, and yeah, I hope it was a useful conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, John, for coming on. It certainly was a useful conversation, and I think this will be a really valuable episodes that folks, as they get into the season, might want to listen to again, kind of as they get closer to these moments that they might think about this kind of testing. So thanks again for coming on. And to our listeners, thank you for listening and sticking with us here. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.